$20. That was the price Alistair Finch put on a person's soul. He didn't hand it over in a back alley deal. He left it on a $100 bill, a deliberate, insulting undertip for a meal that cost more than the waitress's annual rent. He thought she was just another cog in the service machine, a pair of hands to fetch his wine and clear his plates. He thought his power, carved from a mountain of concrete and steel, made him a god. He was wrong. In the gilded cage of New York's Michelin-starred restaurant scene, one mistake can ruin a reputation. But treating Maya Washington like she was invisible? That mistake was about to cost Alistair Finch the one thing his billions couldn't buy back: his own life. This isn't a simple tale of a rich man getting his just desserts. It's a scalpel-sharp dissection of what happens when systemic arrogance collides with hidden genius. Stay with this story, because the justice that unfolds isn't just served. It's meticulously prepared, plated, and delivered with devastating precision. The air inside Ethelgard was different from the air on the street. Outside, on the Upper East Side, the October evening was crisp and smelled of rain-washed pavement and taxi exhaust. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of money, truffled butter, and a faint, almost imperceptible floral note from the towering arrangement of white orchids that dominated the lobby. It was an atmosphere designed to suffocate the outside world, to create a hermetically sealed bubble of opulence. Maya Washington knew the air well. She breathed it in for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. At 24, she was a senior waitress, a position she held with a quiet, almost unnerving competence. Most of her colleagues saw the job as a stopgap, a way to pay for acting classes or studio space. For Maya, it was a laboratory. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a student of the culinary arts, but her passion wasn't in the heat of the kitchen. It was in the cool, precise world of food science, a scholarship student at NYU's prestigious program. She understood the Maillard reaction not as a chef's trick for browning meat, but as a complex chemical cascade of amino acids and reducing sugars. She knew why a hollandaise sauce breaks on a molecular level. This knowledge was her secret, a quiet power she carried beneath her starched black uniform. Tonight was a Finch night. The entire staff vibrated with a low-grade hum of anxiety. Alistair Finch, the real estate titan whose name was branded on half the skyscrapers piercing the Manhattan skyline, was a regular. Not a beloved regular, but a feared one. He treated Ethelgard as his personal dining room, its staff as his private servants. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and left out in a sandstorm. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing and forgave less. "He's at table 12, his usual," whispered Jean-Pierre, the maître d'hôtel, his French accent thick with dread. "He's with his son, the useless one, and he's already sent back the water. Said it tasted municipal." Maya nodded, her expression unreadable. She took a deep, centering breath, the way her grandmother had taught her. "Dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you hand it to them, child." Her grandmother had been a cook in a segregated diner in Alabama, and she had faced down men far worse than Alistair Finch, with nothing but a level gaze and a perfectly fried piece of chicken. Maya approached table 12. Finch didn't look up. He was polishing a pair of antique silver cufflinks on the corner of the pristine white tablecloth, an act of such casual desecration that it was clearly intentional. His son, a soft, doughy man in his 30s named Arthur, offered Maya a weak, apologetic smile. "Good evening, Mr. Finch, Mr. Finch," Maya said, her voice calm and even. "May I get you something from the bar to start?" Finch held up a hand, a silent command to stop talking. He finished his polishing, then looked at her. It wasn't a look between two people. It was the look a biologist gives a specimen under a microscope. He scanned her from her polished black flats to the neat bun at the nape of her neck. "You're new," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I've been here for 2 years, sir," Maya replied, her voice unwavering. Finch grunted, a sound of dismissal. "The usual. The Chateau Margaux. 82. And make sure it's decanted properly this time. The last girl who served me might as well have put it in a blender." He waved a dismissive hand. "And tell Chef Antoine, the lobster bisque, better not have that gritty texture again. It's unacceptable." Before Maya could respond, he turned his attention to a man approaching their table. This man was different. He was younger, perhaps in his late 30s, dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored dark grey suit with no tie. He had an air of quiet intensity, his eyes constantly scanning, analyzing. This was Julian Croft, the reclusive tech billionaire who had made his fortune in logistics algorithms and AI. He and Finch were circling each other over a massive Hudson Yards development deal, two predators from different jungles forced into the same territory. "Alistair," Croft said, his voice a low baritone. "Julian, I didn't realize they let people in here without a tie," Finch sneered. "They make exceptions for those who could buy the building," Croft replied smoothly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. His eyes flickered to Maya for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement, before returning to Finch. As Maya turned to retrieve the wine, she overheard Finch's next command to his son. "Arthur, for God's sake, sit up straight. You look like a sack of laundry. You're a Finch. Try to remember that." The wine cellar at Ethelgard was a hushed sanctuary of stone and cedar. Maya selected the 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost more than her semester's tuition. She handled it with the reverence of a museum curator. As she prepared the decanter, Chef Antoine stormed in, his face red and puffy. "Did you tell him about the bisque?" he demanded, his French accent even thicker than Jean-Pierre's. "I relayed his comment, Chef," Maya said. "His comment. He complains about grit. There is no grit. It is the paprika, smoked Spanish paprika. It has a texture. The man has a palate of a goat." He threw a towel onto the counter. "He has a list of allergies a mile long. No shellfish, no peanuts, no sesame, and he complains about paprika. I should put shellfish in his soup, a tiny bit, just to teach him a lesson." "Chef," Maya said, her voice sharp. The casual cruelty of the remark chilled her. She had seen the allergy list on Finch's profile. It wasn't just a preference, it was a life-threatening reality. The cross-contamination protocols for his table were intense. "Bah, I am joking," Antoine grumbled, though his eyes held a flicker of something that wasn't a joke at all. He snatched a shrimp from a prep bowl, popped it in his mouth, and then wiped his hands on his apron before stalking out. Maya watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She made a mental note. Antoine had just handled shellfish. Back at the table, the decanting process was a silent performance. Maya executed it flawlessly. Finch watched her every move, looking for a flaw, a tremor, a single drop of wine to spill on the tablecloth. She gave him none. As she poured the first glass, he stopped her. "Wait," he said. He reached into his waistcoat and produced a small, ornate silver box. From it, he took a single, perfectly clear ice cube and dropped it into the priceless, room-temperature Bordeaux. A collective, silent gasp seemed to come from the surrounding tables. Julian Croft raised an eyebrow. Arthur Finch sank lower in his chair, as if wishing the floor would swallow him whole. It was a power play of the highest order, a deliberate, vulgar act of destroying something beautiful just to show that he could. "There," Finch said, swirling the now chilled red wine. Perfect. Maya's face remained a mask of professional neutrality, but inside a cold fury was building. It wasn't about the wine. It was about the casual, gleeful desecration. It was about the message. Your rules, your traditions, your expertise mean nothing to me. The meal progressed, a slow-motion ballet of tension. Finch sent back his steak, claiming it was 4 degrees past medium rare. He complained that the asparagus was too green. With each complaint, he would look at Maya, a small, cruel smirk on his face, enjoying her forced servitude. Julian Croft, sitting at a nearby table, watched the entire exchange, his expression unreadable, his fork moving with analytical precision. He wasn't just eating, he was gathering data. The breaking point came with dessert. Finch had ordered the Grand Marnier soufflé. As Maya placed it before him, his hand brushed against a water glass, knocking it over. The water spread across the tablecloth, pooling near his son's plate. "Clumsy girl," Finch snapped, his voice like a whip crack. "Look what you've done. You've ruined a Xenia suit." Arthur, who hadn't been touched by a single drop, stammered, "Father, it was you." "Silence, Arthur," Finch commanded. He looked at Maya, his eyes glinting. "You will clean it up. Now. With this." He reached down, unclipped one of his silver cufflinks, a family crest, she noted, and tossed it onto the wet tablecloth. "And you will not leave the table until you have." It was a test, a public humiliation. He wanted to see her grovel. He wanted to see her break. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. Jean-Pierre started to move forward, to intervene, but a sharp glare from Finch froze him in his tracks. Maya looked at the cufflink, a small silver island in a sea of white linen. She looked at Finch's smug, expectant face. She thought of her grandmother, standing tall in that Alabama diner. Dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you hand it to them. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze level and direct. She held his stare, not with defiance, but with a profound and unnerving stillness. She was refusing to play his game. Seconds stretched into a minute. The silence grew heavy, uncomfortable. Finch's smirk began to falter. He had expected tears or fumbling apologies or angry defiance. He hadn't expected nothing. He hadn't expected to be rendered irrelevant. "Well," he demanded, his voice rising, "are you deaf? I gave you an order." From the corner of her eye, Maya saw Julian Croft place his napkin on his table. He was watching the scene not with pity, but with a sharp, calculating interest, as if he were witnessing a critical variable being introduced into a complex equation. Finally, Maya spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "No, sir," she said. "I am a waitress. I serve food. I do not clean up messes you have made." She turned, not in a huff, but with a deliberate, measured grace, and walked away from the table, leaving Alistair Finch sitting in a stunned, sputtering silence, his power play utterly dismantled by a 24-year-old woman who had just handed him back his own game. The air in Ethelgard had changed. The fragile bubble of manufactured civility had popped, and the raw, ugly reality of the man at table 12 was on full display for everyone to see. The humiliation was no longer hers, it was his, and the night was far from over. The kitchen was a pressure cooker of whispers and wide eyes. Maya's quiet act of defiance had sent shockwaves through the staff. Jean-Pierre intercepted her by the service station, his face a mixture of terror and awe. "Maya, what have you done?" he hissed. "He will have you fired. He will have me fired. He will buy the restaurant just to fire the busboy. He knocked over his own glass and tried to make me his maid, Maya said, her voice still steady, though a tremor of adrenaline was starting to course through her. There's a point where a job description ends and subjugation begins. I found it. Chef Antoine, however, was furious. He stormed out of his office, brandishing a spatula. You've insulted my most important customer. Who do you think you are? You are nothing. A girl who carries plates. You will go back out there. You will get on your knees if you have to, and you will apologize. Apologize for what, chef? Maya asked, her gaze unflinching. For not allowing him to humiliate me for his own amusement? It is not your place to have pride. It is your place to have a job, he roared. A glob of spittle flew from his lips and landed on the pristine steel countertop. Before Maya could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Actually, it's her place to maintain the standards of the establishment, which, I assume, do not include forcing employees to perform demeaning personal tasks for abusive patrons. Julian Croft stood at the kitchen's entrance, having followed Maya from the dining room. He surveyed the scene with the same analytical calm he'd displayed earlier. He wasn't playing the hero, he was observing a system in failure. Chef Antoine's face went from red to purple. Mr. Croft, this is a private staff area. Your kitchen door was open, Croft said, his eyes landing on Maya, and I believe your waitress is owed an apology, not from Mr. Finch, who is incapable of it, but from you for demanding she sacrifice her dignity for your bottom line. Antoine was momentarily speechless, caught between the wrath of one billionaire and the unexpected intervention of another. Maya simply nodded at Croft, a silent acknowledgement of his support before turning back to the chef. I'm finishing my shift, she stated, not asking for permission. She walked to her locker, ignoring the stares of her colleagues. She needed a moment to herself, to let the adrenaline subside. As she leaned against the cool metal, she replayed the scene in her head. The dropped cufflink. Finch's sneer. And then another detail surfaced, far more important. Chef Antoine, after handling the shrimp for his snack, wiping his hands on his apron. The same apron he was still wearing as he supervised the plating of every dish, including Finch's. A cold dread, sharp and specific, washed over her. It wasn't just a hygiene issue. It was a ticking time bomb. She walked back into the main kitchen area, just as the servers were lining up for the dessert course. Finch, having apparently recovered from his shock and decided to prolong the evening as a show of dominance, had ordered for the table. Table 12, soufflés are up, Antoine called out. He personally inspected each dish. Maya watched his hands. He adjusted a raspberry on one plate, wiped a smudge of chocolate from another. His apron, potentially contaminated with shellfish proteins from his earlier snack, brushed against the counter where the plates were lined up. The risk of microscopic cross-contamination was low, but it wasn't zero. For a man with an allergy as severe as Finch's, microscopic was all it took. Stop, Maya said, her voice cutting through the kitchen clamor. Everyone froze. Antoine turned to her, his eyes blazing. What now? You handled shrimp earlier, chef, Maya said, keeping her voice level and factual. And you didn't change your apron. You've been working over the dessert station. You can't send those plates to a table with a severe shellfish allergy. Antoine laughed, a short, barking sound. Are you insane? I touched a shrimp an hour ago. You are trying to sabotage my kitchen because you are in trouble. It's not sabotage. It's basic food safety protocol, Maya insisted. Anaphylaxis can be triggered by trace amounts of an allergen. We need to remake the desserts in a sterilized area. Get out, Antoine snarled, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. You are fired. Get out of my kitchen now. She's right, Julian Croft said. He hadn't left. He was standing by the door, his phone in his hand. He'd apparently been listening to the entire exchange. The potential for liability is astronomical. If he has a reaction, this restaurant will be sued into non-existence. Your insurance won't cover willful negligence. The word liability was a bucket of ice water on Antoine's rage. He hesitated, but his pride, fatally wounded by Maya, won out. "This is my kitchen," he screamed. "I decide what is safe. The desserts go out." He shoved a plate into a waiter's hands. "Go. Now." Defeated, Maya watched them go. She had done what she could. She had warned them. Now, she could only watch the inevitable unfold. She turned to Croft. "Thank you for trying to help." "I wasn't helping," he said, his gaze intense. "I was investing. In competence. It's a rare commodity." He paused. "What's your name?" "Maya Washington." "Julian Croft." "Ms. Washington, I'd like to talk to you when your employment situation is resolved." Before she could process his words, a commotion erupted from the dining room. A choked cry, followed by the sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor. Jean-Pierre burst through the doors, his face ashen. "It's Finch!" he gasped. "He can't breathe!" Maya didn't hesitate. She pushed past the panicked maître d' and ran into the dining room. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Alistair Finch was on his feet, clutching his throat. His face was bloating, turning a terrifying shade of crimson. His eyes were wide with panic as he clawed at his collar, making horrifying, rasping sounds. He was in the grip of a full-blown anaphylactic shock. Arthur was screaming, "Somebody help him! He has an EpiPen! In his coat!" A waiter fumbled through Finch's jacket pockets, his hands shaking too much to be effective. Chef Antoine stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of pure horror, the reality of his arrogance crashing down on him. The other patrons were standing, staring, pulling out their phones to record. Maya took control. The chaos seemed to slow down around her as her scientific mind took over. "Get the pen," she commanded the waiter, her voice ringing with an authority that cut through the panic. "And call 911. Tell them it's anaphylaxis, potential laryngeal edema." She used the precise medical term, hoping to convey the urgency. The waiter finally produced the auto-injector. Arthur grabbed it, his hands trembling. "I don't know how to use it." "Give it to me," Maya said, taking the device from him. She knew the protocol. She'd studied it. Blue to the sky, orange to the thigh. But as she pulled off the safety cap, her mind raced. The reaction was incredibly fast, terrifyingly aggressive. An EpiPen delivered epinephrine, which would counteract the histamine reaction. But something was wrong. The speed of the onset. It was too violent. Her eyes scanned the table, the soufflé, half-eaten, the wine, the single, clear ice cube, now mostly melted in his glass. Wait. The ice. Her brain made a lightning-fast connection. Finch's file. He was on a beta blocker for his heart condition. It was a detail buried deep in his guest profile, a note from his assistant. Beta blockers can severely inhibit the effectiveness of epinephrine. A standard dose might not be enough. He could go into cardiac arrest before the paramedics even arrived. "Is there a second pen?" she asked Arthur, her voice urgent. "No, that's the only one." There was no time. She had one shot. She looked at Finch, who was now stumbling, his lips turning blue. She had to make the dose as effective as possible. "Lay him down!" she shouted to Julian Croft, who had moved to Finch's side. "Elevate his legs. We need to keep the blood flowing to his vital organs." Croft, without a word, guided the massive man to the floor. Maya knelt beside Finch. She pressed the orange tip of the EpiPen hard against his outer thigh, through the fabric of his expensive trousers, and held it for a full 10 seconds, counting aloud to keep herself steady. 1, 2, 3. The pen clicked, the needle delivering its life-saving cargo, but Maya knew it might not be enough. She looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on the dessert cart. On it was a small butane torch used for crème brûlée. An idea, born of desperation and chemistry, sparked in her mind. "Get me that torch," she yelled to a stunned busboy. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "Now!" The busboy scrambled to retrieve it. Maya turned to Croft. "I need pressure on his chest. If he stops breathing, you start compressions." Croft nodded, his face grim, his analytical mind clearly processing the gravity of the situation. He placed his hands on Finch's chest, ready. Maya took the torch. She knew from her studies that heat could degrade certain proteins, but this was a wild, unproven long shot. Her real target was something else. Anaphylaxis causes a massive drop in blood pressure as capillaries dilate. The epinephrine was fighting that, but it was a losing battle against the beta blocker. She needed to create a secondary shock to the system, something to jolt his circulatory system. A localized, intense thermal stimulus. It was a crazy, dangerous idea. But doing nothing was a certain death sentence. She ignited the torch. A blue flame hissed to life. She didn't apply it to his skin. That would just cause a burn. She aimed it at the silver cufflink still lying on the tablecloth. "What are you doing?" Arthur shrieked. "Saving your father's life," Maya said through gritted teeth. She held the flame on the solid silver piece for 5 seconds until it glowed a faint red. Using a thick linen napkin to protect her hand, she picked up the superheated piece of metal. Finch's breathing had become a faint, shallow whistle. His eyes were starting to glaze over. "I'm sorry for this, sir," she whispered. She pressed the hot cufflink firmly onto the fleshy part of his forearm, away from any major arteries. Finch's body convulsed. A guttural roar escaped his lips. His eyes flew open, no longer glazed, but wide with shock and pain. And then he took a breath. A deep, ragged, shuddering gasp of air. The color began to return to his face. The rasping in his throat lessened. The single dose of epinephrine, boosted by the massive jolt of the pain stimulus, was starting to win. It was a brutal, desperate, and brilliant move. She hadn't just treated the symptom, she had shocked the entire system back into fighting for itself. The distant wail of sirens grew closer. Maya sat back on her heels, the torch clattering from her hand, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had just saved the life of the man who had tried to destroy her dignity, and in the process, in front of a room full of New York's elite and one very intrigued tech billionaire, she had shown everyone exactly who she was. Not a waitress, not a victim, but a force of nature. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights and official voices. Paramedics swarmed Alistair Finch, stabilizing him, loading him onto a gurney. His eyes, as they wheeled him past, found Maya's. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. For the first time, he saw her. Really saw her. The police arrived, then the health department inspectors. Ethelgard was declared a crime scene, or at the very least, a major health code violation site. Chef Antoine, white as a sheet, was stammering incoherently to a detective, his career evaporating before his eyes. The restaurant was shut down indefinitely. Maya found herself sitting on a plush velvet chair in the now empty lobby, a blanket draped over her shoulders by a shell-shocked Jean-Pierre. The weight of what had happened, of the life-or-death decision she had made, settled upon her. The hot cufflink. It had been a wild gamble, a hypothesis tested on a human subject in real time. It had worked, but the sheer audacity of it left her trembling. Julian Croft approached, holding 2 cups of water. He handed one to her. He didn't offer platitudes or praise. He simply sat down opposite her, his analytical gaze softened with something new. Respect. Beta blockers, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. You knew he was on beta blockers. Maya nodded, taking a sip of water. It was in his file. They can render epinephrine less effective. The reaction was too fast. I needed to buy the epinephrine time to work. The thermal stimulus, the pain. I hoped it would trigger a significant enough endogenous adrenaline release to supplement the EpiPen. Croft stared at her. You diagnosed a pharmacological conflict in the middle of a crisis and improvised a solution based on theoretical physiology. You did that while a man was dying in front of you. He shook his head slowly. You're not a waitress. I'm a student, Maya said quietly. Food science, chemistry, biology, a little organic chemistry. I see, Croft said. He fell silent for a moment, processing. He wasn't looking at her like a damsel in distress he had rescued. He was looking at her like a venture capitalist who had just discovered a unicorn in the wild. I came here tonight with the intention of poaching Chef Antoine, he said. I'm launching a new division of my company, a food tech incubator. We're working on everything from sustainable protein sources to advanced nutritional delivery systems. I thought Antoine's reputation would give the venture credibility. He gave a short, dry laugh. My algorithm was wrong. I was looking for the wrong person. He leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on her. I don't want to offer you a job, Miss Washington. Jobs are for people who follow instructions. I want to offer you the silence that followed. The sirens was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't peace. It was a vacuum, the sound of a world holding its breath. For Maya, sitting in the gilded lobby of Ethelgard, under the weight of a paramedic's shock blanket, the silence was filled with the phantom hiss of a butane torch and the echo of a man's ragged, life-affirming gasp. The adrenaline had scoured her system clean, leaving behind a crystalline clarity. She hadn't acted out of anger, or pity, or even a sense of justice. She had acted as a scientist. Alistair Finch had been an equation spiraling towards zero, a system in catastrophic failure. She had simply intervened, applying a radical variable to alter the outcome. The morality of it was a problem for later. Right now there was only the cold, stark fact of her own capability. Julian Croft sat opposite her, not speaking, observing her with the same intensity he'd shown at the dinner table. He wasn't looking at a hero. He was looking at a phenomenon, a rare data point that had defied all his predictive models. He had come to witness a power struggle between two titans, and had instead discovered a new form of energy entirely. His file, Croft said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet lobby. The beta blockers. How did you know to look for that specific contraindication? Maya finally looked up, her gaze meeting his. It wasn't a contraindication I was looking for. It was the whole system. You don't understand a person by their allergies alone. You look at their medications, their reported stress levels, their diet, their patterns. It's all interconnected. Chef Antoine saw a list of no's. I saw a physiological profile. Croft leaned forward, the fabric of his expensive suit whispering. You see the world in systems, don't you, Miss Washington? Cause and effect, inputs and outputs, the molecular and the psychological as two sides of the same coin. Don't you? She countered, a flicker of her earlier fire returning. Your algorithms predict global supply chains based on weather patterns and political unrest. Is a human body so different? A slow smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It was the smile of a man who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he was solving. I build systems to move cargo. You understand the systems that move life itself." He slid a card across the marble table between them. It was heavy, made of a matte black metal, his name and a single string of numbers etched in minimalist white. "My offer from before was an impulse. It is now a calculated certainty. I'm not offering you a job. I am offering you a laboratory, a budget that will make the university's endowment look like a rounding error, and a single directive. Build the future of food. I don't care what it looks like. I'm investing in your process." He stood, leaving the card on the table. "The world is full of people with degrees, Miss Washington. They know how to follow the map. I'm looking for a cartographer. Call me when you're ready to draw." He walked out into the flashing blue and red lights of the New York night, leaving Maya in the deafening silence of her own potential. The first 3 months at Croft Labs were the loneliest of her life. The facility was a cathedral of science in Red Hook, Brooklyn, a vast, white-walled space smelling of sterilized air and ozone. Her team consisted of 7 PhDs, specialists in fields so narrow she could barely grasp their titles. They called her Ms. Washington, with a chillingly correct politeness that was far more insulting than Antoine's open hostility. They saw her story as a fluke, a media curiosity. They saw a waitress, not a director. Her imposter syndrome was a physical weight, a constant, low-grade nausea. In meetings, they spoke a language of published papers and academic citations, a closed loop of credentials she could not enter. She, in turn, saw things they missed. She saw the subtle hesitation in a young biochemist's hands, and knew he lacked confidence in his own data. She noticed how the lab's workflow created intellectual silos, preventing the protein specialist from talking to the fermentation expert, though their work was deeply intertwined. She saw the system, and it was inefficient, broken by ego and tradition. The breaking point came during a presentation on their flagship project, a plant-based steak designed to perfectly mimic the texture and flavor of a dry-aged ribeye. Dr. Iris Thorne, a pompous, silver-haired protein chemist, was explaining their failure. "As you can see," he said, pointing to a complex chart of protein chains, "we're experiencing irreversible protein denaturation during the final shearing phase. The texture is gummy. We've tried a dozen polymers, adjusted the pH, recalibrated the temperature. It's a dead end." Maya stared at the slide, but her mind was elsewhere. It was back in the kitchen at Ethelgard, watching Chef Antoine make a hollandaise sauce. He'd always insisted on using clarified butter. "You must remove the milk solids. The whey," he would say. "They are impurities. They will make the sauce break." He was wrong, of course. The milk solids weren't impurities. They were stabilizers. "Have you tried adding an impurity?" Maya asked, her voice quiet in the sterile conference room. Thorne paused, looking at her over the top of his glasses. "An impurity? Miss Washington, we are trying to achieve protein purity of 99.8%. "I know," she said, standing and walking to the whiteboard. "But you're thinking like a chemist. Think like a cook. What gives a real steak its texture? It's not just pure muscle fiber. It's the marbling, the fat, the collagen, the imperfections. You're trying to build a perfect, sterile structure, and it keeps collapsing because it has no scaffolding, no forgiveness." She picked up a marker. "What if you introduced a small amount of a complex carbohydrate, like a modified starch from a specific potato varietal? Something that doesn't bond, but gets physically trapped within the protein matrix. It wouldn't be a binder, it would be molecular grit. It would disrupt the perfect alignment of the proteins, forcing them to form a more chaotic, cross-linked structure, like collagen in a real muscle." The room was silent. Thorne stared at the board, his mouth slightly agape. He had spent 6 months trying to solve the problem with more purity, more control. The idea of deliberately adding a disruptive element, of embracing imperfection, was so counterintuitive to his entire training that it bordered on heresy. It was also brilliant. That afternoon, they ran the experiment. The result was revelatory. The texture was perfect. For the first time, her team looked at her not as the waitress who got lucky, but as a mind that saw a different kind, a truth. She hadn't used an equation. She had used an analogy from a broken source. She had, in essence, diagnosed the system. From that day on, they started calling her Maya. Alistair Finch requested the meeting 4 months after the incident. He didn't summon her. His assistant sent a polite, formal email asking if Ms. Washington would be willing to meet Mr. Finch at his offices, at her convenience. The shift in power dynamics was seismic. She agreed. His office, occupying the entire top floor of a skyscraper he owned, was a testament to brutalist minimalism. It was less a room than a declaration of dominance over the city sprawling below. Finch himself was diminished. The granite certainty of his face had been eroded, leaving something softer, more uncertain. He used a cane, and his hand, when he gestured for her to sit, had a slight tremor. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its commanding timbre. "I've spent the last few months reflecting. In a hospital bed, one has little else to do." He looked out the window at the city he had conquered. "I built this empire on a simple principle. Find the weakness in any system, in any person, and exploit it. It's how you win. That night, I tried to do it to you. I saw a young woman in a service uniform, and I assumed weakness. I applied pressure, expecting you to break." He turned to face her, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, now clouded with a deep, chilling confusion. "But you didn't. And then, when my own body betrayed me, when every system within me was failing, you did the opposite. You found the weakness, the beta blocker conflict, and you didn't exploit it. You fixed it. You saved me." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the head of his cane. "I have not slept a full night since. The question haunts me. Why? Why would you save me?" Maya considered him. She could give him a simple, comforting answer about human decency, about doing the right thing. But he wasn't a man who dealt in platitudes. He was a systems analyst, just like her. He deserved a systems answer. "With all due respect, Mr. Finch, you're asking the wrong question," she said, her voice calm and even. "You assume the decision was about you. It wasn't. You were a critical biological event, a puzzle presenting itself in real time. My intervention wasn't an act of forgiveness. It was an act of compulsion. I am driven to understand how things work and to solve for X when a system is broken. In that moment, you were the broken system, the cufflink, the torch. They were just the reagents I had on hand." He stared at her, and for the first time, a flicker of comprehension dawned in his eyes. She hadn't saved him out of kindness. She had saved him out of competence. In her world, this was a far greater and far more terrifying compliment. It meant she was operating on a level he couldn't even perceive, let alone dominate. His bullying was an irrelevant variable in her equation. "I see," he said softly. He slid a thick envelope across the vast desk. "This is a cashier's check for $1 million. It's a pathetic, inadequate gesture, I know. But it's the only language I'm fluent in." Maya picked it up. She felt the weight of it in her hands. It was the price he had put on his life, a life she had saved. She thought of her grandmother. Dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you hand it to them. Finch's money was a form of power, but it was his power, tainted by his methods. Using it for herself would be a form of subjugation. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, her decision forming with the same crystalline clarity she'd felt in the lobby of Ethelgard. "I know exactly what to do with it." She didn't endow a scholarship. That was too passive. With Croft's legal team, she established the Washington Foundation, a non-profit that provided seed funding and mentorship for brilliant young scientists from underprivileged backgrounds who, like her, didn't fit the traditional academic mold. She wasn't just giving them money. She was building them a new system, a pathway that hadn't existed for her. She was using the old world's currency to finance the new world's talent. It was the most elegant chemical reaction she could imagine. 2 years later, the Alembic. Opened on the same hallowed ground where Ethelgard had fallen. The name was Maya's choice, a tribute to the alchemical vessel used for purification and transformation. The entire restaurant was a manifestation of her philosophy. The kitchen was encased in glass in the center of the dining room, a stage of transparent competence. The staff, from the general manager, a grateful Jean-Pierre, to the dishwashers, were salaried partners who shared in the profits. There was no hierarchy of abuse, only a collaborative system of respect. The menu was a quiet revolution. There were no foams or gimmicks. Each dish was an exploration of science made delicious. A scallop seared to a perfect Maillard crust using focused acoustic waves. A consommé clarified through a centrifuge, its flavor impossibly pure. And at the center of the menu was the Croft Labs steak, an elegy to the beauty of imperfection, served on a simple white plate. On opening night, Julian Croft found her standing not in the spotlight, but in the shadows of the service station, her eyes scanning the room, monitoring the flow, the acoustics, the emotional temperature of her creation. "It's flawless," he said, standing beside her. "A perfectly calibrated system." "No," Maya said, a small smile touching her lips. "It's not perfect. It's resilient. It's designed to have a little give, to absorb the unexpected. Perfection is brittle. Resilience endures." Her eyes settled on a table near the window. Table 12. It was occupied by a young couple. They were dressed up, clearly nervous, their hands clasped together on the table. They were celebrating something, an anniversary perhaps, on a budget that made this night a significant investment. Maya watched as Jean-Pierre approached them, not with the practiced condescension of an old-world maître d'hôtel, but with a genuine warmth, making them feel like they were the most important people in the room. He was explaining the science behind their first course, and their faces, once nervous, were now lit with wonder. That, she realized, was the true victory. It wasn't Finch's apology, or Antoine's ruin, or even the scientific breakthroughs in the lab. It was this. It was replacing a system built on fear and exclusion with one built on dignity and discovery. It was the quiet, meticulous, and irreversible transformation of a space, a culture, and herself. "He left you $20, Julian mused, his eyes following her gaze to table 12. Alistair Finch, on a $100 tip, the ultimate insult. Maya watched the young couple laugh, their faces illuminated by the candlelight. She felt the quiet hum of the room, the symphony of a system working in harmony. She had taken the broken pieces of that night, the humiliation, the fear, the violence, and used them as raw material. She had distilled them, purified them, and transformed them into this. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a profound and gentle peace. "He did. And I used it to change the formula.